Did you ever have to pretend everything was fine when it really wasn't?
My sister told the family I was bad for the holiday vibe. She said it with that breezy confidence people use when they think their opinions are group policy, and everyone just nodded because it was easier than pushing back. And I smiled like it was a joke, even though my stomach did that drop it does when you realize you are not just unwanted for a moment. You are unwanted as a principle, as in let's keep the peace by removing the person who keeps pointing at the mess. Here is what no one at that table said out loud while my parents exchanged those pleading glances, and my aunt cleared her throat, and my sister leaned back like a judge who had just delivered a merciful sentence. Which is that for years I have been the one who made sure the spinning plates stayed upright. I am the one who paid late fees when a certain someone forgot due dates. The one who put groceries in a certain someone's kitchen when the card kept declining. The one who swallowed sarcasm and rephrased it into something digestible so our mother would not spend the night crying and our father would not retreat into that long disappointed silence that turns a living room into a courtroom. And I did it because it felt like the adult thing, the older child thing. The thing reasonable people do when family is messy and you are tired of drama, even though you are also the one quietly funding the absence of it. I did not argue with Melissa that night, because I have learned that arguing with someone who speaks in declarations is like trying to put out a kitchen fire with the same oil that started it. You just get more smoke and worse stains. So I let her lay out her whole case about how I always bring tension, and I always want to talk about hard things, and I always make people feel judged. And then she tilted her head and said it would be better for everyone if I skipped Christmas this year, as if she were doing me a favor by removing a chore from my calendar, and everyone exhaled like the solution had been found and the room would finally relax. On the drive home, I kept hearing her phrase, bad for the holiday vibe, like I was some flickering light bulb ruining the photos, and I went through the mental slideshow we all keep archived under the title Am I Overreacting? The one with images like the time she forgot her car payment and I wired money because the tow truck was literally circling the block. Or the week she insisted she needed help with rent because she had taken unpaid days to care for a friend's child and then posted a new handbag on social. Or the day my mother asked me privately whether I could keep sending the grocery money a little longer because it helped stop the fights. And I said yes, because I thought I was helping to stabilize the family when in reality I was just keeping the truth from landing. I got home, fed the dog, opened my laptop, and stared at the familiar spreadsheet I keep for my own sanity with all the little outflows and little inflows that make a life functional. And you know how sometimes you look at a set of numbers and suddenly you are not just looking at math, you are looking at a portrait of yourself, and the portrait said I had been spending a quiet tax on keeping my sister likable, and that the interest rate on resentment had matured, and that I was the only person who could close the account. I replayed the dinner in my mind and kept stopping at the moment my parents looked relieved. Not because they wanted me gone, I do not think they want anything bad for me, but because they wanted the noise to stop. And I realized that I had been their noise-canceling headphones for years, absorbing the sharp sounds so they could pretend the house was quiet, and that is not love, that is logistics disguised as virtue. And if anyone was going to change, it would not be the person benefiting most from the current setup. It would have to be me. So I poured a glass of water, took a long breath that felt like pulling the fire alarm, and started checking files I had not opened in a while because I did not want to see the fine print of my own enabling, and there it was. The lease paperwork for the car Melissa drives, the car she reminds everyone she negotiated herself because she once talked down a salesman on floor mats, the car whose credit check ran through my name because her score was, to quote the polite letter, below acceptable range at the time, and I remembered the exact conversation where she promised it was temporary and she would refinance, and it would be off my back in a year. And then months slid by and I stopped asking because avoiding fights became easier than insisting on agreements. I found the account portal, clicked through the security nonsense, and stared at the renewal toggle like it was a red button under glass, and I thought about all the times I said I did not want to fight while quietly volunteering to absorb the cost of avoiding one. And I realized this was not a fight, this was a correction, and corrections are not cruel when they are overdue, they are just uncomfortable for people who have grown used to the cushion, and then I did the simplest thing I have done in years. I turned off the automatic renewal. I scheduled a call with the leasing company for the morning. And I drafted an email in plain language stating I would not be extending the agreement and any future correspondence should go directly to the driver on file because my obligation ends at the term date. I sat there listening to the house, which was just a house again and not a conference room, and my phone buzzed with a new message from the family group chat. A string of cheerful checkmarks and holiday emojis and updates that suddenly felt like they belonged to a club I had been funding without ever wanting to join. And I looked at the little text field and typed nothing, because nothing was the most honest thing I could say. People will tell you moments like this feel triumphant, but it felt more like standing up slowly after sitting too long, everything a little numb and pins and needles prickly. And underneath the discomfort there was a clean line of certainty that I had finally stepped out of the role everyone kept handing me, which is not the role of the monster who ruins the holiday vibe, but the role of the adult who stops setting herself on fire to keep the room warm. And because I know how my family operates, I know that tomorrow there will be phone calls and explanations and dramatic revisions of who said what at dinner, but tonight I did one thing that cannot be spun or softened. And in the morning, a very polite person from the leasing company will confirm that the renewal is canceled, and the countdown clock that no one but me knew existed will start ticking in my sister's world. And for once, I am not going to be the one to reach over and hit snooze. The call from the leasing company came earlier than I expected, a bright and chipper voice confirming receipt of my non-renewal notice and asking if I wanted to schedule a return appointment now or wait until they contacted the driver. And I said I would prefer they contact the driver because I was stepping out of the middle, and then I hung up and just sat there with the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the kind of silence you only get when you have finally decided that you do not have to explain basic boundaries to people who have spent years pretending your boundaries are optional, and I felt a strange calm settle in, not joy exactly, more like the kind of steadiness you get after telling a dentist to stop drilling because the numbness never took and you are done pretending it does not hurt. It took less than an hour for Melissa to ping me with a text that started breezy and then turned sharp. She said the dealership had called and there must be a mistake because they said her lease would not be renewed and she was due to schedule an inspection. And she added a laughing face to soften it, the classic move, as if we were sharing a weird bureaucratic glitch, and I typed a careful response that I deleted 3 times before sending the one that said it plainly. There is no mistake. The lease has been in my name for years and I declined renewal, and I would encourage you to make whatever arrangements you need so you are not stranded on the return date. And I hit send and put my phone face down because I did not need to watch the typing bubbles do their little dance before the inevitable explosion. The explosion arrived on schedule, a long tirade about how the car was essential to her work and how I was sabotaging her life and how our parents would never forgive me for putting her in danger. Which is a wild sentence if you think about it for more than 10 seconds, because if a grown adult is in danger because a lease ends on the date it was always scheduled to end, the issue is not the lease. The issue is the fantasy that other people will throttle their credit and their patience to keep your life cushioned, and I wrote back that the lease was always temporary. I had covered the payments and the insurance to help her through what she called a transition, and that a transition does not last forever. And she should plan as if she were the only person responsible for her own transportation because, surprise, she is. Then the parental cavalry arrived, first with the kind message about how they understood things had been tense, but maybe I could extend the lease just a little longer to help my sister get back on her feet, and when I did not immediately fold. The message turned into the heavier version about family loyalty and how this would ruin the holiday season if Melissa could not drive out to the house and how they were worried about her mental state, and I said calmly that I was not cutting her brakes. I was ending an agreement that should have ended years ago, and if transportation to their house mattered that much, they could pick her up or she could take a bus or they could celebrate a week later like flexible adults. And the silence that followed was the kind I have learned to recognize, the kind that says people are recalibrating their leverage and deciding whether to try guilt, panic, or nostalgia next. I wish I could say I was unshakable, but I am not made of steel, and after the 3rd voicemail from my mother with that quiver she uses when she wants me to feel the heat without accusing me directly, I had to take a walk around the block to remind myself that consistency is not cruelty and that other people's discomfort is not proof that I am doing something wrong. Sometimes it is proof that I stopped doing something wrong, and by the time I came back, I had made up my mind that if I was going to pull the thread, I might as well pull it cleanly, which meant not just the car but the other quiet pipelines I had kept running because it seemed easier than turning off the valves while people watched. So I opened my banking app and scrolled to the recurring transfer I had named months ago with a neutral label to keep it from screaming at me every time I reviewed my budget. The grocery stipend that had started as a one-time favor when Melissa was short after a dental bill and had somehow become a monthly ritual that bought more than bread and eggs. It bought convenience and takeout and weekends that looked pretty on social. And I stared at the date and felt that little spike of anxiety that says if you press this button you cannot unpress it without an argument, and then I pressed it anyway. I canceled the transfer, I deleted the nickname, and I told myself out loud because sometimes you have to hear your own voice to believe it. If she is hungry, she has a family with a stocked pantry and 2 parents who can cook and a long list of friends who love to trade leftovers. And she also has 2 hands and a brain and the ability to figure out a budget like the rest of us. The message she sent after that one was textbook, a flurry of accusation and self-pity and denial. She said she would literally starve, which is not how any of this works, and she called me heartless, and then in the same breath reminded me of all the times she had been there for me, like that time she lent me a dress for an event. Which would be funny if it were not so telling, because when you are used to being rescued, any act of basic sharing feels like proof of sainthood, and I typed back that I was not arguing with her, and I was not going to list receipts. I was simply done paying to keep our family from facing the consequences they keep trying to outsource to me. Predictably, my father called and went straight to the big guns, the talk about how families stick together and how I was turning money into a weapon, and I said with all the calm I could manage that money had been a shield for years. I had used it to block conflict so no one had to look at how Melissa manages her life, and that I was done holding it up because my arms were tired and it is not my job, and if they chose to pick up the shield, that was their choice, but they could not lay it at my feet and pretend I had dropped it. He sighed and said I was making it impossible to have a normal holiday, and I said maybe a normal holiday is one where everyone brings what they can and no one pretends that the invisible person did the heavy lifting. And he went quiet in that way that tells me he has heard something he cannot unhear, and then he said he would call me later when my mother had calmed down, and I said take your time, because time is exactly what I am giving all of us. Time without my wallet in the middle, time without the fake piece that costs me interest, time to see what happens when the grown child is asked to be a grown adult. By evening, the group chat had shifted into its usual stream of distractions, memes and dinner photos and jokes that used to feel like a warm blanket and now feel like a curtain that keeps the room dim. And I watched for a minute and realized that if there was going to be a show, I did not have to sit in the audience, and I hovered over the leave conversation button and felt the old reflex to stay quiet and stay helpful and stay present. And then I thought about that dealership call and the canceled stipend and the way my mother's voice sounded when she begged me to just make it easy one more time, and I press leave, no note, no explanation, no apology, just the clean exit that says I am not here to be the stagehand anymore. And the second I did it my phone went still in a way I had not felt in years. The best part is that I have not even played my last card, because there is one more piece no one talks about and I have the paperwork to prove it, and when the calendar reaches that date, she will finally have to stand on her own or admit to the whole family what she has expected me to carry, and I am ready for either outcome, because whichever way it goes, it will not be me paying the price for everyone else's comfort. When I left the family group chat without a farewell or an explanation, it was not a dramatic flounce, it was more like putting down a bag I had been carrying for years and realizing my hands still worked. And in the hours that followed, I understood something I probably should have understood a long time ago, which is that when you remove the audience, the performer loses half the power. Because so much of Melissa's chaos has always depended on having people watching and reacting and taking sides, and without that steady chorus of aunts and cousins chiming in with sympathy or outrage, the noise could not gather itself into a storm, it just sputtered, and then it came at me in private where it always shrinks. She tried calling first, a rapid sequence of rings that I let slide into voicemail because I wanted her words recorded and not performed, and the message was exactly what you would expect. A mix of disbelief and accusation, and that strange tone she uses that sounds like a scolding kindergarten teacher who is sure you will apologize if she just keeps talking. And she said she did not understand why I would embarrass her with the dealership and humiliate her by cutting off the grocery money and then disappear like a coward, and I just sat at the table with my coffee going cold and thought about how in our family the word embarrassment is used like a smoke bomb. Throw it down, disappear in the confusion, and maybe no one will notice who pulled the pin. I did not call back because I had already learned the hard way that the first person to talk is the first person to apologize in our particular household culture, and I was done going first, so instead I pulled up the list I had started the night before. A plain little document with bullet points that were not dramatic or vengeful. They were simply the truth written down in a way that could not be spun. Things like remove her as an authorized user on my roadside service plan, switch my toll, pass back to single vehicle because she has been using it and the invoices keep landing in my mailbox. Call the insurance and confirm that the policy lists only me and my car because that generous add-on we did when her rates were sky high is a fossil from a time when I was willing to take a ding for the team. And as I worked down the list, making calm calls and answering identity questions and waiting on hold with that odd elevator music that always sounds like it is trying to soothe you into giving up, I felt that same steadiness from the day before, the one that comes when you realize you are not being cruel, you are just being clear. There is something incredibly revealing about the way people escalate when attention dries up, because within an hour my mother texted me privately to ask whether I could return to the chat for a single day so they could sort out the holiday plans without drama. As if my silence were the source of the drama rather than the absence of it, and when I said kindly that I was not rejoining and they could call me directly if there were logistics that required my involvement, she sent the longest message I have seen from her in years, a rope of words tied together with worry and guilt and the old plea to be the bigger person, and I typed slowly because I did not want to write the kind of sentence you regret for the next decade. And I said I had been the bigger person for long enough, and now I was simply being a person, and she responded with the sentence that has gotten me to reverse course so many times, which is that my choices were making things harder on everyone, and I said with all the gentleness I could find that sometimes harder is what happens when easy has been a lie. The practical stuff kept unfolding exactly the way practical stuff does, which is without surprise once you finally look at it head-on. The roadside plan removed the extra driver. The toll pass account reset to a single plate and sent a tidy refund for the overpayments that had been riding on autopilot. The insurance confirmed what I already knew but needed to hear anyway. And when I hung up the last call, I realized I had been paying not just in dollars, but in mental bandwidth, because my mind felt like a room you can walk through without bumping your hip on stacked boxes, and I do not care if that sounds dramatic. I needed that room back. Melissa, deprived of witnesses, tried a new angle and forwarded me a screenshot of a calendar invite to a supposed work meeting that required her to drive across town twice a week. The implication being that I was endangering her employment by forcing her to give up the car, and I stared at the screenshot and felt the old urge to cave, because the word employment in our family is like a precious relic that buys unlimited indulgences. And then I looked closer and saw the meeting title, a vague phrase I happened to recognize because it is the same title she used for a meetup group she runs that has nothing to do with income, and I just wrote back that I wished her a productive week and that public transportation routes are posted online. And I muted the thread because sometimes the only way to win is not to play. You asked for revenge that feels like justice without turning me into a villain, and here is the part that might test that line for some people but not for me, because when I opened the file cabinet and pulled the manila folder with her name on it, the one I have avoided for years because it makes me feel like a treasurer for a club I do not believe in, I found the apartment paperwork with the guarantee clause we signed when her credit was in the basement and the landlord would not touch her without someone standing behind her, and there in tidy type was the renewal window, a narrow little period that had always slid by because I automatically re-signed like a trained seal. And this time I took out a pen and wrote the date on the back of my hand because I wanted it where I could see it every day, not as a threat, not as a countdown to disaster, but as a reminder that change is not real until the paperwork changes too. Before anyone tells me I am playing dirty, let me be clear that I am not sneaking or sabotaging or setting traps. I am contacting the landlord within the notice period and stating in clear language that I am not renewing my guarantee. And I am sending it by certified mail because I have learned that you need proof when people enjoy telling the story without the boring details. And I am copying my sister because I do not play games in the shadows. And I will not be arguing about it or bargaining it down to one more year or one more favor. I am simply stepping out of a role I should never have been cast in, and whatever adjustments she chooses to make are her business, not mine. I sealed the envelope and set it by the door and felt that strange mix of grief and relief that comes when you finally respect your own limits. And if that sounds self-help, why? Fine, but I have earned the right to say it without rolling my eyes. Because I have done the late-night transfers and the emergency calls and the so-called quick fixes that last forever, and this boring responsible action felt like the first thing that might actually change the story. Because when the guarantee ends, the myth ends too. The myth of the independent baby sister who somehow navigates life with charm and a little luck. And I am not out to destroy her. I am out to stop pretending I am not the one holding the safety net. And here is where I will leave it for now, because the letter goes out in the morning, and once it does, the calendar stops being hypothetical, and there is one more call I plan to make that will put a lock on the last door she keeps slipping through, not to trap her, but to keep me from being dragged back in. And when that is done, the next time my parents call with that shaking worry in their voices, I will finally have an answer that is not a speech. It is a simple sentence even they cannot misinterpret, and it will land like a gavel whether they like it or not. The certified letter went out first thing in the morning because I wanted a timestamp that no one could argue with, and while I was at the counter the clerk asked if I wanted return receipt, and I said yes, even though it cost extra. Not because I enjoy paying a premium for paper, but because in my family a fact does not become a fact until you can hold it in your hand. And by the time I got back to the car, I already had 2 missed calls from my mother and 1 from my father and a cluster of messages from relatives who suddenly remembered my number when they realized the group chat could no longer serve as the town square, and I looked at the screen and knew exactly how the day would go because I have lived this cycle for years. The soft push followed by the hard push followed by the threat disguised as worry. I answered my mother first, because that has always been the doorway you step through if you want the rest of the house to calm down. And she launched into a careful monologue about how Melissa had made mistakes, but was trying, and how the holidays were already stressful, and how my choices were pouring gasoline on a situation that needed water. And I told her in a voice I barely recognized as mine that I was done being the fire department. I was done driving the truck. I was done paying for the hose, and I was done taking the blame when people stood too close to the flames they lit. And she said I was being cruel, a word she knows hits me like a dart, and I said I was being consistent, which is what cruelty looks like to people who are used to exceptions with their names on them. My father called right after, and where my mother pleads, he negotiates, so he asked for an extension on the car and a trial restart of the grocery transfer and maybe, his word not mine, a symbolic return to the group chat for the sake of appearances. And I told him that appearances are what got us here, because when you keep the picture pretty long enough you start believing the frame is reality. And then he played the only card left, the one about Melissa's mental health and how he is worried she will spiral. And I told him gently that the safest thing for everyone, including her, is to stop reinforcing the idea that she cannot stand up unless someone else holds her by the elbows. And if he disagreed, he could make a different choice. But I would not be making it with him. By noon, Melissa had found a new tactic and started texting me screenshots of sympathetic messages from cousins I have not seen in years, little curated highlights of people calling me harsh and cold and overreacting. And the old me would have crafted a point-by-point response or called one of those cousins to give context, but the new me put the phone down and opened a different account page. The one for our old family phone plan that I have kept for far too long because it was easier then. unraveling it, a plan that still had a line attached to Melissa's phone because years ago she swore she would transfer it to her name next month, and then next month kept arriving like a bus that does not stop. And I scrolled through the options while my brain ran the familiar tape about how pulling the plug would be petty and vindictive and would make me look like the villain, until I remembered that villains hide, and I am not hiding. I am cleaning up paperwork that ties me to bills, credit checks, and midnight messages from carriers about overage charges I did not run up, and I pressed the button to remove the line. And the system asked whether I wanted to release the number to the user for transfer, and I selected yes, because I am not trapping her. I am handing her the handle to her own door. Within minutes she called, because of course she did, and she went straight to loud, declaring that I had cut off her lifeline and stranded her, and that her two-factor codes now would not come through, which meant she could not log in anywhere, and everything was my fault. And I said calmly that I had authorized the number for transfer, and she could pick any carrier she wanted within the day and set up her own account like every other adult, and she said that required a deposit, and I knew where that sentence was going, so I said I understood and I would not be paying it, and then she said something that told me exactly why all of this was necessary. She said, "You know I am not good at this stuff," and I said I know. "That is why I am done making sure you never learn." The voicemails from my parents shifted tone in the afternoon, less pleading and more warning, with a lot of talk about how families remember who is generous and who is not, and I wanted to laugh, because if there is one thing my family remembers, it is the performance of generosity, the public gestures and the speeches about sacrifice, whereas the quiet transfers and the phone bills and the leases signed in other people's names are treated like natural resources that do not need to be mentioned, because they are simply there. And when I did not call back, my father sent a final text that said, "Think about the long game. We will all still be here after this," and for the first time I agreed with him out loud. I said, "Exactly." Which is why I am setting the long game on a different track. Late in the day, the landlord's office emailed a standard acknowledgement that my guarantee non-renewal had been received and logged, that the current lease would run its course and any renewal would require independent approval without my backing. And I read it twice, because it felt like the first official document in years that recognized what I have been saying quietly to myself, that I am not a spare parent, and I am not a private bank, and I am not responsible for the image my family wants to present to itself when it gathers around a table and pretends we all got here on the same terms. And I forwarded the email to Melissa with a single line that said, "So you have time to plan." And then I closed my laptop and stared at the ceiling and let the panic pass through me without chasing it. If you are waiting for remorse, I do not have it. What I have is a low, steady anger at myself for taking this long and a cautious hope that maybe the next holiday will be quieter, not because I am excluded, but because no one will have the energy to perform when there is no audience left to confirm the script. And as I got ready for bed, my phone lit up again with another voicemail from my mother in that shaking voice that usually pulls me back in, asking me to please talk to them before I do anything I cannot take back. And I looked at the sealed return receipt on the counter and the confirmation email in my inbox and the phone plan screen that now shows one line instead of two, and I thought, that is the point. I am done taking it back. And then the doorbell rang, because Melissa does not knock like a normal person when she wants something. She presses until the chime becomes a siren, and when I opened the door she stood there with her phone dead and her face set and said, "You do not get to end my apartment." And I said, "I am not ending your apartment. I am ending my signature." And she took a breath that told me she had planned her next move, and she said, "Fine, then I will show everyone the messages." And that is when I smiled for the first time in days, because she still does not understand that the audience has left the theater, and tomorrow morning the mail carrier will put a small green card in my box that says the landlord signed for my letter. And when that happens, there will be nothing left to argue about, only the last card I have not played yet, the one that makes it impossible for anyone to drag me back into the middle ever again. The last card was never meant to be theatrical. It was meant to be final in the way a locked door is final, not because it is dramatic, but because it refuses to argue. And after the confrontation on my porch and the chorus of messages telling me to think about the long game, I sat with a notebook and wrote a list that did not ask anyone for permission. A clean inventory of every door through which I had been pulled against my better judgment, and then I walked through them one by one and turned the keys from my side, because if you do not want to live at the center of everyone's emergency, you have to stop leaving your name on the forms that create emergencies. I started with the quiet backbone of modern chaos, which is credit, because for years the easiest way to keep peace was to let people use my name as the shortcut around their own roadblocks. And I told myself it was temporary, and I told myself it was family, and I told myself it would be fixed as soon as things stabilized, which is how you end up living in a permanent emergency disguised as kindness. So I placed freezes with all 3 bureaus. And I added verbal passwords that only I know, and I set alerts so that if any inquiry tried to slip through, the call would go to me and only me, and I made it very clear in writing that no one was authorized to open, extend, co-sign, or otherwise hitch their wagon to my score again, and that if anyone tried to act on my behalf, I would treat it as identity misuse, not as a misunderstanding over coffee, because the era of misunderstandings had ended the moment I stopped paying for them. Then I moved to the boring utilities that have a way of becoming handcuffs when you ignore them, the shared memberships and lingering auto pays and legacy accounts that were easier to maintain than unwind, and I closed them or transferred them to my name alone. Not because I want to live on an island, but because I want to live in a house where the bills reflect the people who live there, and I added a layer most people forget until it bites them. I put verbal passcodes on my bank accounts and my phone carrier and my insurance, and I added notes to my file stating that authorizations cannot be added or changed without in-person validation, which means that even if someone tries to be clever and calls with a trembling voice about a family emergency, the system will say no before I ever have to repeat myself, and I know that sounds clinical, but bureaucracy is a tool, and for once I used it for me. After that I did the thing I had been avoiding because it felt like an unnecessary escalation when I floated it in my head, but on paper it made sense, and once it made sense it became non-negotiable. I drafted a short letter that I had notarized. A simple statement of non-responsibility that lists the accounts and obligations that once included my name and now do not, with dates and confirmation numbers, and I sent copies by certified mail to the landlord, to the leasing company, to my insurer, and to my parents for their records, not as a threat and not as a performance, but as a record that exists outside of the family story we keep rewriting every time someone gets nervous. And in that same envelope to my parents I included a page that was as generous as I could make it without lying, a clear boundary written like a neighborly contract, that I love them and I want a relationship. And I will meet for dinner, and I will take calls to talk about life, but I will not finance, guarantee, or manage Melissa, and any request that smells like logistics will get a polite no without a second round. When the green slip started landing back in my mailbox, little proofs that my letters had been signed for and logged, the tone from my parents shifted in a way that made me both sad and relieved. Because instead of the pleading and the lectures I got the kind of messages you hear when people have realized the decision is real and the old language no longer works, so they try a new one, and my mother called to say she wanted to talk face to face like adults, and my father sent a single sentence, asking whether I would be open to a conversation after the holiday once everyone had a chance to cool down, and I said yes to both. Not because I owe them a debate about choices I am allowed to make, but because I want them to know I am still here. Just not in the position they want me in, and that is the whole point, to remain a daughter without remaining a donor. Melissa did what Melissa does when the audience is small and the stakes are real. She cycled through every role she knows. The victim who cannot survive, the prosecutor who keeps case files of my supposed coldness, the comedian who makes it all sound like a bit. And then finally the negotiator who offers a compromise that is really the old arrangement with a new bow, and when none of it moved me, she tried the card she thought would force my hand, which was to put our parents between us and swear that if I did not reinstate at least one of the support beams, she would have to move and it would devastate them, and I said the sentence I had been practicing for weeks so that it would not wobble. I said, "I am not choosing for you, I am choosing for me." And if you move, and if they are devastated, they are devastated, and I will not trade my sanity to keep anyone's image intact. On the day the car inspection was due, she sent a flurry of messages about how humiliating it felt to show up alone and how cruel it was to let strangers handle something we could have handled as family, and I did not respond because there was nothing to say. And later that week she messaged from a new number because she had finally, begrudgingly, set up her own phone account, and the message was short and raw and said she hoped I was happy because she felt like I had cut her loose, and I stared at it for a long time because there was a time when that word would have sent me sprinting back to undo everything, and then I wrote back in one slow paragraph that I did not cut her loose, I cut myself loose, and there is a difference. She has always known how to swim, she just preferred the boat I kept rowing. As for the apartment, the landlord followed the process exactly as I knew they would. They offered a renewal with conditions that required Melissa to meet standards she has dodged for years by leaning on my signature. And whether she meets them or chooses a smaller place or moves in with a friend is not a cliffhanger I need to dangle over anymore, and saying that out loud felt like taking a heavy coat off in a warm room. You do not realize how much you are sweating until the air hits your skin. And no, I am not going to apologize for that relief, because it does not come from malice, it comes from finally believing that other adults can carry their own weight or learn what happens when they do not. The voicemails from my parents still arrive, though fewer now, the tone softer, the words less loaded, and sometimes I listen and sometimes I do not, and I have decided that my response will not be immediate, not because I want to punish them, but because I am building a rhythm that is not dictated by alarms other people set, and when I do pick up, I will say what I wrote in that letter and what I have said to myself every morning since I mailed it, that I love them, that I want to see them, that I will show up with dessert and stories and patience, and that I will not bring my checkbook, my credit, or my ability to be blamed when the performance falls apart, and if that means some holidays include fewer people and more honesty, then maybe that is not a tragedy, maybe it is the first normal we have had in years. So no, I did not reconcile in a tearful group hug, and I did not torch the earth on my way out. I just reached for the parts of my life that had been quietly rented out and I took them back, and the last card was not the letter or the freezes or the passcodes. The last card was the refusal to argue about whether I am allowed to protect my peace, because the moment you stop explaining yourself to people who benefit from your confusion, you win, and they can call it cold or harsh or unloving, and they can leave messages that tug at every tendon you have, and maybe one day I will sit at a table with all of them again, and it will be weird and also fine, and maybe it will not happen for a long time. I can live with either. Because the ending is not that they accepted my terms, the ending is that I made them, and I kept them, and when the phone lights up now with another voicemail asking me to talk, I think I will on my terms, and then I put the phone down and let the silence be mine.